He was minutes away from signing the one document that would destroy his entire empire. If this already made your blood boil, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss stories where justice finally wins. The sun wasn't even fully up when Richard Vaughn, billionaire and owner of a 40-year empire, stood alone in his glass office, hands trembling, sweat soaking through a shirt that probably cost more than some people's rent. From the hallway, anyone could see he was trying to steady his breathing, but failing. Across the polished floor, a black janitor, Deshaun, pushed his cleaning cart quietly, keeping his eyes down the way people like him had learned to do in buildings filled with rich men who never learned their names. But today wasn't like other days. Today he heard something, a whisper, a panic, something breaking inside that office. When he glanced up, he saw Richard flipping through a stack of documents with the desperation of a man counting down the seconds to his own funeral. A single page sat on the desk, the signature line already marked with blue arrow. Declaration of Financial Insolvency. Deshaun froze. He had seen forms like these before, when his father's shop went under because a supplier scammed him and the bank refused to help. The memory burned like a bruise behind his ribs. He tried to move on, mind his business, pretend he didn't see anything. But then, a voice snapped down the hallway. "Hey, Chad." The floor supervisor, a white man with a chin like a fist and a temper to match, stormed toward him. "Why are you standing there? You think you're CEO now?" Deshaun swallowed. "Just doing my route, sir." "Route?" Chad scoffed. "You're barely qualified to push that cart. Move." He shoved the cart with his knuckles, sending a spray bottle rolling across the tiles. Deshaun muttered an apology and bent to grab it. And that's when he noticed a folder lying slightly open on the floor inside Richard's office. It must have fallen when Richard slammed a fist earlier. A number on the page caught his eye. Bold. Wrong. Impossible. The total debt didn't add up. Not even close. His heart kicked. His pulse roared. And for the first time in his life inside this building, he stepped forward instead of stepping back. He looked at that one number again. And in that moment, Deshaun knew, if he didn't say something, this man's entire empire would collapse. Over a lie. And no one else in this building would ever notice. But what he noticed next wasn't supposed to exist at all. If this happened in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you stand for fairness, hit subscribe. Deshaun didn't mean to stare. He didn't mean to pause. But that wrong number on the page hit him like a cold blade pressed behind the ribs. 47 million, not 64. He checked again. Numbers didn't lie. People did. His breath tightened. His father used to say the same thing before the world swallowed him whole. And now here was again the same kind of mistake that destroyed a black man just trying to provide for his family. He looked down the hallway. No one was watching. Chad had already disappeared, probably off to bully someone else. The office was quiet. Too quiet for a morning when an empire was supposed to fall. Deshaun stepped inside the office. Just one step. His fingers hovered over the folder. He didn't touch it, just looked. Page after page, the numbers kept telling the same story. Fake debt padded with fake names. Someone wanted Richard Vaughn to sign away everything at 10 a.m. sharp, and they'd almost succeeded. Deshaun swallowed hard. He couldn't warn Richard. The man didn't even know his name, and Chad would fire him before he finished a sentence. He couldn't ignore it either, not when this smelled exactly like the scheme that ruined his father. But there was one thing he could do. He reached into the pocket of his work pants and pulled out a torn sticky note, the kind he used to keep track of which floors needed extra mopping. His hands trembled as he wrote. The numbers don't match. Someone added 17M. Check page 7. He didn't sign it. He didn't dare. Then he slipped the note between the pages, closed the folder, placed it neatly back on the desk, and stepped out before anyone could see him. But the moment he pushed his car into the elevator, a wave of panic crashed over him so hard he almost staggered. What if Chad saw him leave the office? What if Richard thought he was stealing? What if this whole thing got pinned on him? He pressed a palm to his chest, trying to slow the pounding. As the elevator descended, he whispered under his breath, not a prayer, Not exactly. More like a promise to the memory of his father. I'm not letting them do this again. When he reached the lobby and pushed through the cold morning air, he didn't know one thing. The note he left upstairs was about to change both their lives. Because sometimes it only takes one person to see what an entire boardroom is blind to. If you believe talent can silence every insult, share this video. And to everyone watching from the US, UK, and Canada, your voice matters. Richard Vaughn stared at the folder like it was a loaded gun pointed at his life. He had returned to his office after stepping out for fresh air, his last attempt to calm the spiral happening in his chest. When he saw it, a yellow sticky note. Not his, not his assistant's, not part of the file. He picked it up slowly like it might burn him. The numbers don't match. Someone added 17M. Check page 7. His breath hitched. Someone noticed? Someone saw what he had been too panicked, too exhausted, too blindsided to see? He flipped to page 7. 47 million, not 64. His stomach dropped. His hands shook so violently he had to grip the edge of his desk to stay standing. Someone padded the debt. Someone wanted him bankrupt by 10 a.m., someone inside his company. He read the note again, eyes narrowing. Who wrote this? That's when he saw the faint smear on the corner. Disinfectant residue mixed with a tiny streak of something brownish red. Not ink, not dirt, a bruise maybe or blood. His janitorial staff worked on this floor before sunrise. Richard grabbed his phone, so fast it slipped once. Julie, he said urgently when she answered. Find out if any cleaning staff are still in the building. Let me check. Actually, he cut in. Find out who cleaned this floor between 6:30 and 8 o'clock. And track them. Now. He didn't wait for a reply. He marched out his office, scanning the hallway with the intensity of a man hunting for the person who just saved or warned him. At 9:17 a.m., his phone buzzed. Mr. Vaughn, Julie said breathlessly. Only one janitor was on this floor this morning. His name is, tell me later, he snapped. Just keep him in the building. He took the elevator down, so fast the doors barely kept up. The lobby felt enormous, each footstep echoing like a countdown. He scanned every corner, and then he saw him, Deshaun, standing near the glass doors, head lowered, ready to leave. Hey! Richard shouted, voice cracking with urgency. Deshaun froze. The billionaire, worth more money than most cities, rushed toward him, gripping the folder in one hand and the sticky note in the other. He stopped right in front of Deshaun. You! Richard whispered, breath unsteady. Did you write this? Deshaun didn't trust his voice, so he nodded once. Richard's throat tightened. You just saved my life, he said. You saved everything. At exactly 9:59 a.m., the entire 24th floor felt suspended in air, like the building itself was holding its breath. Deshaun sat quietly on the leather couch near the window, palms pressed together, trying not to shake. He'd never been this high up in the tower, without a mop in his hands. The skyline looked unreal from here. Like another world, he wasn't supposed to step inside. Across the room, Richard Vaughn stood behind his desk, face pale but eyes burning with a focus he hadn't felt in months. He kept glancing at the clock as if every second mattered. Because it did. Whatever happens, he said without looking at Deshaun, don't let him talk down to you, and don't let him make you feel small. Deshaun nodded, though his heartbeat was thundering against his ribs. A soft buzz cracked through the silence. Mr. Vaughn, Julie's voice came through the intercom. He's here. Richard inhaled deeply. Send him in. The glass door opened. Austin Monroe walked in like a man who owned the place. Tailored gray suit, silver hair perfectly combed back, confidence dripping off him like cologne. He smiled when he saw Richard, but raised an eyebrow when he noticed Deshaun. Well, Monroe chuckled, walking closer. Didn't know we were inviting the help. Deshaun lowered his gaze, jaw tightening. Richard didn't smile back. Sit down, Austin. Monroe sat, crossing his legs, relaxed and arrogant. You look terrible, Rick. Late night? I almost signed something that would have destroyed this company, Richard said quietly. Funny thing, Someone caught a detail you didn't. Monroe's jaw twitched barely, but his smile stayed. Rick, come on. You've been under pressure. Anyone can misread. Richard slid the sticky note across the table. Monroe picked it up, scanned it, blinked once, then twice. That tiny, involuntary reaction betrayed him. Richard continued, voice cold. 47 million, not 64. And the 17 million added? Fake creditors. Fake debt. Fake numbers. Monroe leaned back, shrugging. You're trusting a janitor's prank? That janitor saved me from signing away 40 years of work, Richard snapped. And he noticed something your team didn't, or didn't want to. Deshawn lifted his head. I didn't prank anyone, he said softly. I just know when numbers don't match. Monroe scoffed. This is absurd. Rick, I've been by your side 15 years. You really think I'd... Richard tapped his keyboard. The TV screen behind him lit up with two documents. Left, the original ledger. Right, Monroe's alter version. The mismatched numbers glowed like crime scene evidence. Monroe's confidence cracked. Richard stepped forward. I checked the logs. You access a file before sunrise. That proves nothing, Monroe snapped. Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. It proves everything. The door opened. Security stepped in. Monroe stood fast, face flushed with rage. You're making a mistake, Rick. No, Richard said, eyes locked on him. I'm correcting one. Security escorted Monroe out as he cursed under his breath. Loud, bitter, defeated. Silence returned. Richard turned toward Deshawn. You didn't just save my company, he said softly. You exposed a man who tried to burn it down. The moment the door slammed behind Monroe, the room fell into a heavy, echoing silence, the kind that settles only after a man who thought he was untouchable finally collides with reality. Deshawn sat frozen, unsure whether to breathe or apologize for existing in the same room. Everything felt unreal. The confrontation, the evidence, the billionaire taking his side. It was too much, too fast. Richard looked at him with an expression Deshawn had never seen before on a man wearing a $10,000 suit. Gratitude. Come with me, Richard said. Deshawn hesitated, but followed him out of the office, down the hall, and into a smaller conference room where HR was already waiting, pale, nervous, clearly sensing that something massive had just happened. Richard stood tall, voice steady. There was an incident this morning involving one of my supervisors, he said. Deshawn's jaw tensed. Chad, did he touch you? Richard asked quietly. Deshawn swallowed. He shoved my cart, hit me across the back of the neck, said I should learn my place. Richard's eyes darkened. Not in my building. He turned to HR, effective immediately. Terminate Chad's employment. Collect his badge. Escort him out. The HR rep blinked. Sir, should we open an investigation first? Document nothing, Richard said, voice cutting like a blade. Fire him. Now. HR scattered. Deshawn just stared. No one's ever stood up for me like that, he whispered. Richard faced him fully. You stood up for me first. Then he reached into a folder and handed Deshawn a sealed envelope. What's this? Deshawn asked. Your new position, Richard said. Junior audit assistant. Salary, training, everything covered. It felt like the air left Deshawn's lungs. I don't belong in an office. Yes, you do, Richard said. You saw what trained executives missed. You saved this company. And I won't let someone with your eye for detail stay invisible. For a moment, Deshawn couldn't speak. Memories of his father, working 2 jobs, breaking his back, still dismissed every time he tried to be heard, flashed across his mind. Finally, he nodded. Okay. By the end of the week, he walked into the 18th floor for the first time, not with a mop, but with a badge. But the air up there was different. Employees whispered when he passed. Some stared with curiosity, some with doubt, some with resentment. By Thursday, he heard the nickname, the Janitor Miracle. They said it with tight smiles, polite voices, and eyes that didn't hide what they really felt. Deshawn didn't respond, didn't complain, didn't break. He just kept showing up, learning fast, and proving, line by line, ledger by ledger, that he deserved to be there, whether they liked it or not. By the start of the second week, Deshaun had memorized more financial codes than he ever thought possible. He'd fill an entire notebook with notes, arrows, patterns, small discoveries, things most new hires took months to grasp. But something darker started showing between the lines. It began with a vendor invoice, a payment that shouldn't exist, a company that wasn't real, a signature that didn't match the others. He flagged it, thinking it was just a clerical error. But then he found another, and another, 3 different logistics partners, all sharing subtly altered addresses and identical payment cycles, just under the approval threshold that required executive review. It was too perfect, too controlled, too intentional. He brought it to Clara, the senior auditor assigned to train him, a woman with silver hair, sharp eyes, and a reputation for being unshakable. She read through his findings without speaking. Then she looked up slowly. "Where did you get these dates?" "They were in the shared folders," Deshaun said. "Why?" Clara exhaled through her nose, the kind of breath people take right before they say something dangerous. "Because these files weren't there yesterday." Deshaun felt his stomach flip. Clara lowered her voice. "Someone doesn't want these numbers seen, and someone moved them back the moment you opened them." He frowned. "Why would anyone hide vendor payments?" "Because shell companies are the easiest way to steal money," Clara said, "especially if the right people sign off." Deshaun's hands tightened around the papers. "You think this started with Monroe?" "No," she said softly. "I think Monroe was small time, but whoever's behind these, they're bigger, smarter, and still here." A chill climbed his spine. That afternoon, when he tried to access 2 more related files, a warning flashed on his screen. "Access restricted. CFO level only." CFO, Deborah Sandhurst. The woman who walked through hallways like she owned oxygen. The woman who hadn't spoken 2 full sentences to him since he joined. The woman whose eyes always sharpened when she saw him reading anything financial. Clara appeared beside him. "She restricted your access?" "I didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly. "That's the problem," Clara replied. "You're doing things a lot of people wish you'd stop." Deshaun swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" "We keep digging," she said, "but off the books." For the first time since the confrontation with Monroe, Deshaun felt real fear. Not the fear of losing a job. Not even the fear of being underestimated. This was the fear of discovering something powerful people had buried, and knowing they'd bury him too if he got too close. The deeper Deshaun went, the clearer it became. Someone at the top had been moving money long before Monroe ever slipped. Someone with power, access, and no intention of being exposed. Late one evening, long after most employees had gone home, Deshaun sat alone in the quiet glow of his computer screen, scrolling through file paths that shouldn't exist. One vendor trail led straight into a dead end. Another looped back to a consultant who never once stepped foot in the building. Then he found a signature. A clean, elegant, practiced signature. Deborah Sandhurst, CFO. His breath tightened. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline through the tall glass windows. For a moment, he felt the old weight he knew too well, the weight of being a man people underestimated, dismissed, or ignored. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't invisible. The elevator chimed. Richard stepped out onto the 18th floor, alone, jacket loosened, eyes tired. "You're still here?" he asked. Deshaun nodded. "I found something. Something big." Richard walked closer, scanning the documents spread across his desk. Shell companies, ghost payments, Deborah's approval stamps. He didn't speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice was low. "Clara warned me we might not be finished," he said. "But I didn't think it would go this high." Deshaun hesitated. "What do you want me to do?" Richard looked at him, really looked at him, with the kind of respect people like Deshaun rarely receive from men dressed like him. "I want you to help me finish what you started," Richard said. "No more secrets. No more lies. No more letting powerful people bury the truth. A slow breath left Deshawn's chest. For the first time in years, he felt something heavy inside him loosen. Something old, something wounded, something inherited from his father's injustice. He nodded. "I'm with you." Richard extended his hand. No superiority, no pity, just partnership. Deshawn shook it, and in that moment, a janitor turned auditor, a billionaire turned believer. Two men stood united against a system built to crush people like one of them. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Deshawn walked into the building with a quiet, steady confidence. Employees still whispered. Some still doubted. Some still didn't look him in the eye. But it didn't matter. He had a seat at the table now. He had a voice. And he had the truth. At the elevator, he paused. His father would have been proud. If you believe justice like this should never stop, share this story and subscribe for more real justice moments.